What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is Medium Quality. What I want to do this week is take a look at 5 albums that my dad gave me. And when I say that, I don't mean that they literally came from my dad, that he literally gave me these records, but rather that each of these 5 albums represents a moment in our shared love of music. For me, growing up, there was always music on in the house. My dad and my mom both really loved music, and I got different things from each of them. And so for me, each of these 5 albums has a story that's tied to it that goes beyond the music itself. So I'm not really going to talk about what makes each of these albums great. If that's something you want to hear, let me know in the comments. We can talk about that later. But today, right now, I want to tell stories about my dad and I listening to music together. And of course, that means I'm not presenting these albums in chronological order as to when they came out, but rather chronological order as to when my dad and I listened to them together. First up, we have Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. I have a very vivid memory of going to the Target in Kokomo, Indiana with my dad and going to the music section. Now, this was back when most of these retail stores were making the transition from selling vinyl to selling CDs. They had these weird plastic spacers that they would put CDs in so that they would be tall enough that you could flip through them in the record bins. I have this distinctive memory of going with my dad and him finding a copy of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on CD. And this was something that I think he was looking for specifically. I can remember it like it's yesterday. He put the CD on, and I laid down in front of the old Toshiba tower speakers that he had in the family room. And I was flipping through that brightly monochromatic CD insert booklet that had like this in it, and just going on a journey. The music was nothing like anything I had ever heard. It was nothing like the Beatles songs that I was familiar with. It wasn't like Revolver or Please Please Me or Meet the Beatles or Beatles for Sale. This was something entirely different. That's an important touchstone for me as someone who loves music. Realizing that music could take me on a journey and being completely lost in it. At this point in my life, I now have 3 copies of this album on the shelf. This is the 2014 Mono Master, which for some reason is really hard to get and is very, very expensive. But as contentious as the 60th anniversary Giles Martin remix is, I don't think that's a bad way to listen to the album, and I think that one's a little bit easier to get. And of course, you can feel free to pick up an old stereo reissue from the 80s, and that's going to do well for you as well. Somehow you've never heard this album. That's okay. Come out from underneath the rock, put this album on, and well, I'll see you later. I'll see you in the future. Next up, we have something completely different. Traveling Without Moving by Jamiroquai. I mean, it must not have been too long after hearing Sgt. Pepper for the first time that my dad came home with a copy of Traveling Without Moving on CD and really blew my mind with how funky this album was. I'd never heard anything quite like it, and I don't know that I ever have since then. There was always a certain kind of music that we would listen to when the entire family was going somewhere. When my mom and dad, brother and sister, and myself were all in the old white Pontiac Transport minivan going somewhere. There was a type of music that we would listen to. But then there was a different type of music that we would listen to when it was just my dad taking one of us or a couple of us somewhere. When he would put in an album like Traveling Without Moving, turn it up, and like we would have fun in the car. It was an experience. This album really typifies that for me because it's such a funky album. It's full of just really fun, listenable jams. It's groovy. It's got a real nice drum and bass rhythm section feel to it. My copy of this is the 2013 remaster that was issued on vinyl. I really love this album, and it very much reminds me of my dad. Moving forward, and somehow also moving backwards, we have Band on the Run by Paul McCartney and Wings. Some years later, I remember seeing advertisements on television for a Wingspan compilation.
Wingspan, the ultimate Paul McCartney and Wings collection, available for the first time ever.
It was a 2-disc thing. One disc was the hits, the other disc was the history, and it really blew my mind because I had grown up listening to the Beatles. We were a Beatles household. I loved the Beatles, and I assumed that after Abbey Road or Hey Jude, there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, I had access to this new music by one of my favorite members of the Beatles. We used to listen to hits and history in that 2-disc collection and talk about which of the 2 discs had the better songs. There were the big radio hits that were on the 1 disc, but then those deeper cuts were so wonderful as well. It was like, if the deep cuts were this good, this must be an incredible band. And eventually I got into more of their history and discography and ended up picking up a few of my own copies of Wings albums, but I cannot put this album on without thinking about my dad. And I've somewhat recently replaced my beater copy of Band on the Run with a remastered reissue on white vinyl that just plays beautifully. I mean, this album deserves to be played, and I'm so glad that I got to discover this music with my dad. So knowing that my family was very much a Beatles family, and personally having taken part in some elementary school lunchroom debates as to who was better, the Beatles or the Beach Boys, and being able to say hands down, no contest, the Beatles were the better of the 2 groups, it might come as a surprise to the viewer that another album that my dad and I kind of discovered together almost is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. I'm not exactly sure who introduced us to this album, but by the time my dad and I started listening to this album, I was in college. I had started listening to more diverse types of music. I started listening to heavier music, metal, emo, hardcore, but there was always a point where I would go back and listen to stuff with my dad, listen to the stuff that we both liked, the classic albums that very much defined my childhood. And so it came as a little bit of a surprise to me once we found this album that it became such a major point of discussion for us. I think it might have been around the time that Brian Wilson was putting together a Beach Boys-esque group to re-record the Smile album as he had originally envisioned it. And in the months leading up to that, my dad and I listened to, I think, the 40th anniversary reissue of Pet Sounds on CD that had both the stereo and mono versions of this album. And we would listen to the whole thing all the way through, basically listening to the album twice and talk about which one was better. You know, we would go online and read about the Smile sessions. I think eventually, some years later, we even got that big Pet Sounds Sessions box set that had like 5 discs, and it was just like rehearsal takes of certain songs. And you could hear Brian Wilson giving directions from the booth. And it was really interesting as kind of an intellectual exercise, loving music so much that you wanted to learn more about it. Of course, this was long before streaming music services made it easy to find any piece of music you could possibly imagine. Our interest in this album and the mystery surrounding the Smile album in the months leading up to Brian Wilson releasing this reinterpreted version of those old songs, we were really investigating it. It felt like we were looking for some treasure that had been hidden for years. And that really was an experience that I'll never forget. It was an important experience because it connected me to my father during a time where we didn't see eye to eye on a number of things. And so I'm really thankful that this album exists, even if it's just for that reason alone. I guess that us spending all that time exploring this music together reignited a long lost interest in the Beach Boys that my dad had from his childhood. And to this day, he is a huge Beach Boys fan, perhaps almost as much, maybe even more than he is a Beatles fan. I don't know. I'll have to ask him about that. But he's a much bigger Beach Boys fan than I am. For me, this is the go-to Beach Boys album. And over the years, I've had multiple copies of this album, one of which even got lost in a breakup, which is a story for another day. The copy that I currently own is pressed to this beautiful yellow and green colored vinyl. Every time I put it on, it reminds me of my dad. Fast forward to 2021. Just a few weeks ago, I flew to Indiana to visit my family, to see my mom and dad. I hadn't been back to Indiana since Christmas of 2019, so over a year and a half ago, because of COVID-19 and the global pandemic and the lockdown. And almost like no time had passed at all. Pretty much as soon as I get home, my dad and I are talking about music, the new stuff we've been listening to, the old stuff that we love. So we get to an album that was literally given to me by my father just a few weeks ago, and that is So by Peter Gabriel. So at some point in the last year and a half, my dad was considering getting into collecting records, and he picked up a copy of this album in the off chance that he would start a collection. And then at some indeterminate point in time after that, he decided, perhaps rightly, that it would be too much of a commitment to get into collecting vinyl, especially when you have to store them all and they're kind of big. And so he decided not to. So when I saw him a couple weeks ago, he pulled this out and said, "Hey, do you want this?" Of course I do. So I opened it up and took a look at it. And this is a 45 RPM double LP pressing of the album from 2016 that's actually even individually numbered. This will definitely be nicer than the one that I have. I had no idea that my dad was even into Peter Gabriel, much less would have this really nice copy of this album. And so even now, my love of music is inextricably linked to the people that I love, the places that I've lived. And now every time that I listen to this record, it's going to make me think of my dad. You know, reflecting on the 36 years that I've known my dad, I'm extremely thankful that he shared his love of music with me, because it's meant so much. It's become a major part of who I am and how I mark my years on this planet. It's a gift that I hope to pass down to my own daughter. I hope that she will see these shelves full of records as a collection of mysteries, a collection of treasures to be discovered, and that maybe someday when she's 36, that she'll reflect on the ways that we shared this thing with each other, and maybe even pass it on to her kids. I don't even know how to express the amount of gratitude that I have for the experiences. They're things that I will never forget. I will always treasure them. And I have these artifacts that I can pin these memories to and hold on to them. And that's going to do it for this video. Guys, if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if for some reason you're really invested in what I'm doing at this YouTube channel, then I'm going to put a link in the description section below where you can get some pretty cool medium quality merch. Until next time, guys, keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.